Hey, let's do this, CNFers. Let's give a shout out to Athletic Brewing, my favorite non-alcoholic beer out there. If you visit athleticbrewing.com and use the promo code BrendanO20 at checkout, you get a nice little discount. I don't get any money, merely celebrating a great product so you can skip the hangover, man. Dry January is over, but, no sense in slipping into bad habits, B.O.
Should I send another message? Should I give up on the sauce? But I always say, one more, I'll try once more. And often that final time is the time where it really unlocks, really.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. I paid for my first hair and beard cut in 21 years because my beard is lacking, and I was like, I'm going to put it in the hands of a professional and see if we can't optimize my face. I look like I could be in the SNL video Dick in a Box. William Ralston is here to talk about his Atavist story. There are some spoilers, so head to magazine.atavist.com to read the story titled Mayday, the race to find 4 children who survived a plane crash deep in the Amazon. This story was widely reported but not better told than what William delivers here. William grabs you from the start, and buckle up, dude, because it's 11,000 words that breeze by like a thread, man. And by that I mean threads, man. He doesn't let you go. He doesn't let go of you. I also speak with Jonah Ogles, the lead editor of this piece, and get his side of the table, which is always the unique part of these Atavistian podcasts. But a few things first. We love kind reviews on Apple Podcasts, and when we get new ones, I love to read them right here. Give you that shout out. Here's Levi Justin Rogers, left a nice review in here. He is titled The Most Metal Podcast on Creative Nonfiction. Yes, that is true. That's me saying that. Here's his review. The best / most metal podcast for those interested in writing CNF or hearing from some of their favorite CNF authors. I love Brendan's style. I love his rages against the algorithms and authenticity about the writing life. Yeah, I always learn about new and interesting books, authors while listening. He also has a great newsletter. We'll get back to that in a moment, but thank you, Levi Justin Rogers. That is amazing. I owe you an email. You can also support the show on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/CNFpod. If you want to help keep the lights on at CNFpod HQ instead of the candles that I keep here, you can help out. If you want to have some spare change, if you got some spare change, $2, $4, $10 a month, we'd be grateful for your contribution here. We got a new patron in Stephanie Patterson. Just want to give you a shout out for your generosity. We also lost one. Q Sad Trombone, Even Steven. Rage Against the Algorithm, man. Newsletter went out today as of this recording, February 1st. Once again, more people unsubscribed than subscribed last month. Just killing it over here. Head to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. For show notes and to sign up for the mailing list. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Or maybe you can. The unsubscribes have been brutal this year. Those really hurt. I started the year with 904 on my list, and now there's 888. Lost nearly 10 today. Oh, brutal. The mailing list and the podcast are the only things I care about. And when people unsubscribe, when you're not annoying and pestering them every week, and they still reject after all the effort you put into a newsletter, like I said, those hurt the small-time author more than anything. I wonder if people would unsubscribe if they knew just how crushing it is to an author's platform, like how complicit unsubscribers are in making the newsletter creator more unattractive to agents and publishers. There are some authors lists that I'm on that I don't really read. Some that I was unknowingly just put on without my permission, but that's a screed for another day. But I won't unsubscribe because I know how important that subscriber number is. Anywho, let's talk to Jonah before I get too sad over here, okay? Riff.
Yeah, I mean, this was a story that was on our radar. We had even, Sayward and I had even like exchanged links. I think she sent the first one back when this was all happening in the news, not even a year ago. We were like, oh gosh, wouldn't that be a great story? And and our first thought was, well, the New Yorker is going to do this. Like it's just too big. They have too many great writers. So, several of them with like pretty impeccable connections to the South America and Central America and Spanish speaking countries. We almost thought like this is too big for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got a pitch from William, and it was like, okay, here's somebody who's thought about it and is on the right track. And we just kept asking about, everything about the story relies on the sourcing,
Yeah.
and so we just kept asking, well, how are you going to get to this person? How are you going to get to this person? And if he hadn't already established contact with them, he knew someone who he had talked to someone who thought that they could get him in contact with them. And so we kept asking questions, and he had just like good answers to them, not always perfect, but he was upfront about what he had and what he didn't and what he thought he could get and how he would try it. And eventually we thought, okay, like we can't ask any more questions. Like he's answered them and it's pretty satisfactory. So let's get him to Colombia and see what comes out. And he his reporting on this, I can't say enough about it. Like I'm in awe a little bit of how deep he was able to get and how many people he was able to talk to.
Yeah, that's something that I've rarely heard you say about being in awe of someone's repertorial chops on a given story, and that's not to denigrate the past pieces, but like the fact that you just said that about Williams speaks volumes to what he was able to accomplish. So what was it about the heft of reporting he was able to accomplish that really made your jaw drop?
I mean, he was just tireless. He just like he does not stop. I'm not sure. He has a newborn, and so I've wondered if like, well, he's not sleeping anyway, so he's he's decided to be reporting as well. But man, I mean, I would get like texts from him in the middle of the night his time, because he's based in London. So I would get texts like just before I went to bed with a question, and then I'd have a text waiting for me when I woke up with another question, and he would say, okay, I think maybe I have a line on this person. So and so is going to tell this person that he's calling at this hour, and he would just call and call and call and call until he finally got somebody on the phone, and then was able to get them to open up and reveal their role in the story and other people's roles. He was just tireless with it. Well, long after the point, there were a couple of times when I even said to him like, okay, pause on the reporting because we've got to get some writing done
Yeah.
on the story, and like we'll catch up on the reporting later, because he just doesn't quit. He gets his teeth into it and he just wants to keep going.
Yeah, that's the thing. I remember talking with Jackie McMullen, the great sports writer, basketball writer, and a big thing with her back in the day, I guess even still to some extent today, she would always be like, when you think you're done, make 10 more phone calls.
Yeah.
And it's like to that point, it's like, okay, that's great. That's the rigor, but at some point, you can get lost in that, and you're like, yeah, eventually you do eventually have to write.
Yeah, you do. You've got to be able to write a draft at some point. You got to hit pause. And even, I mean, God, towards the end of it, there would be small questions. And even when I would say, like, look, if you don't know the answer to this, let me know, because we can probably write our way around it, or, just tell me what you know and what you don't know. And he would still, his response would be, I can get this. I don't know the answer, but I can get this. Let me do it. Like, give me an hour to chase it down. And he would go off and find another person, and make another contact and find it. There were only a few things that in the end we just couldn't really find out, but they were really, really minor details, and we were able to write around them in the end. But yeah, he was committed to finding every last thing that he could.
There was something that struck me about the piece too, and I love when this happens organically, and it does with Williams' piece here. Is how the jungle is in and of itself kind of this character, this
Uh-huh.
essence, and I really love that when you can just like feel the heat and the humidity and the suffocation of the canopy. Like it really,
Uh-huh.
I just love that element of it.
Yeah, totally, totally. I mean, um I loved that about, about this story, that it feels so alive, and it feels it. I mean, it is very much a character in the story, and it even, like, I've sort of gone on a jungle kick since then. Like, I've just keep reading books set in the jungle. I think because this piece is just like, it whet my appetite for it, and I'm
Hmm.
just like, let's keep going. Like, I'm in the jungle mode. Let's keep reading about it.
Yeah, on some roads that I drive through in here in Oregon, just off to the side, like some of these forests, we're just talking like, yeah, evergreens, and you look in, and sometimes 10 or 20 yards in, it almost goes pitch black, and we're
Yeah.
not talking like super like jungle canopy here, and you get a sense that somewhere in the Amazon where maybe no one has ever really traversed, that it is just total darkness, especially in the even when it's sunny out, like during the, it's under there. It's just you feel the claustrophobic feeling of, oh my god, like we're in a box almost.
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, I mean, if the rescuers, the searchers, got too far apart, there was a risk that they would be lost from each other. And we're talking about feet, not miles or anything. It's not a quarter mile away where you get lost. It could be like, 5, 6 yards away that you're getting lost. It's and I mean it, and he goes into all this in the story. It makes it very difficult to find, for children who are out there, particularly if they're worried about being found, for one reason or another. And that's a part of the story, and it's crazy. I mean, it's a crazy story. It's one of those that, like, I talk about all the time. I feel bad for, like, my wife and in-laws and friends who I see most often, because they'll ask me how it's going, and all of a sudden, like, half an hour has gone by, and I'm still talking about this story about these kids.
Yeah. Well, and to your point earlier about thinking that this story was so big that there's no way the New Yorker doesn't kind of swoop in and get this, but it's like you guys kind of got the scoop on this, and that's not something you don't associate Scoop and the Atavist together, and you kind of got it.
I think, as we wrapped up the story, I told William how proud I was to have worked on it, and how I do think, I mean, we set out, we only wanted to do this if we could write the definitive story. We didn't want to write a aggregation of what had been published in other outlets. We wanted to, like, get to primary sources and have this be the story. And and he was able to pull it off, and it does, like, it feels great. It feels great to have actually done it and be able to get it out in the world, because I don't think anybody out there has done what we've done.
Yeah, it must have been an invigorating sense of urgency that maybe you don't
Yeah.
always get all the time with these kind of stories with what you tend to publish.
Yeah, Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it didn't. There was kind of an extra fire lit under us, and it also came together very quickly at the end. We've worked. I was just apologizing to another writer whose draft has been with me for a long time, but I told him, like, I've just, every minute that I've had to work and many minutes that I haven't really had available to work, I've been devoted to this story. If I get a text at 7:30 at night, I'm, you know, eating the last bite of dinner and pulling out my laptop and dealing with it. It was pretty intense for me, but I have a pretty low RPM. I'm a big house cat at heart, so it was a lot, but it's worth it in the end to be able to pull off a story of this quality.
Fantastic. Well, Jonah, this was great to get the your side of the table here. We're going to turn it over to William now. So as always, thanks for the time. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks to Jonah. Thank you, Jonah. William is a journalist based out of the UK. His work has appeared in The Guardian, Bloomberg News, Wired Magazine, Esquire Magazine, and more. He has little to no internet presence, so he doesn't have to deal with demoralizing mailing list unsubscribes. Here's my chat with William. One of the topics I wanted to jump off with you about was just the idea of engendering trust as a journalist, and this story it really hinges on you being able to get that kind of trust. And here you are from UK and to the jungles of Colombia, South America. So it's like, and you're doing a lot of this over the phone. So how did you manage to navigate that?
Well, it began because I kindly spoke to Pedro Sanchez, who's the head of the Special Forces unit in Colombia. A journalist in Colombia gave me his telephone number, and I remember I just called him one day and I just said, in my broken Spanish, I want to tell this narratively. I want to tell this story in great detail. Um, would you be willing to cooperate? And obviously, their work deserves to be celebrated for finding the children, and he was very enthused by the idea. I don't think he quite realised how much effort it takes on behalf of the sources who contribute to these pieces. But it all began with him, and then he gave me the number of many of the other sources in the jungle. For example, Nicholas, the gentleman who actually found the children, and several others. And I just reached out to them, but getting their trust was extremely difficult. They'd been reached out to several journalists before me, because I actually came onto the story quite late. It took a lot of back and forth, and I am pretty dogged in that way. I think it was a case of, in this story in particular, it was a case of telling them, and in fact, it's the same with most stories. Actually, to be honest with you, I was working on another sensitive story before this about the Lucy Letby serial killer, and again, it's about reassuring them that that I'm not going to create sensationalist headlines. I'm going to treat this with the respect and the sensitivity that it deserves. And I'm also going to give you a platform to tell your story in great detail. And I have to sometimes repeat that to them, but by and large, I think it worked most of the time. Almost all of the reporting was done just by just flying around and getting buses around and essentially trying to track them down. Really, I mean, as much as I tried before I arrived in Bogota or arrived in Colombia, anywhere, I couldn't arrange any meetings. It was just about being in Bogota, and we flew down to Villavicencio. There was an earthquake, so we couldn't get the bus. And then I flew down there. I heard that some of them were down there. Some of the rescuers were down there, and I heard that Fatima, the grandmother, was down there, and we met her in a bar, and we chatted to her, went out with her, and I spent a lot of time telling her that I want to tell her story in the detail it deserves, to talk about Magdalena, and to talk about the children, and to really give their side of the story, because I think there's a lot of misreporting about it. And as soon as I sort of explained that to them, that with this word length and with the rigor and the sensitivity that I write with, I think I think that gave them the reassurance. I think sort of sit down with me. But it wasn't easy. It was a huge amount of back and forth. I mean, we spent about, I think, 3 days with Fatima before she actually ended up speaking with us. With Andres, the father of the children, it was the same thing. I mean, I actually spoke to him over Zoom. I had a friend of mine go and sit with him in a meeting room in Bogota, and I zoomed in because I'd come back by that time. But I was going back and forth with his lawyer for about 3 weeks, if not a month, just saying this is what I want to do. He's a voice that hasn't been featured in the story before. His name had cropped up in, I think, several like Daily Mail articles, but nobody had tracked him down, and I managed to track him down, fortunately. And again, he'd almost been missed, and there was a lot of misreporting. And I just said, this is the story that will be definitive, and I want to do it in a way, I want to give you the platform. And I thank God they gave me the trust. And obviously, then it grows from there. Once you have 3 or 4 of the sources, then you can say I've spoken to him, and her, and it's essentially saying, this train is leaving. Do you want to be part of it or not? And by that point, once you get to that stage, then it's a lot easier.
I had seen or heard an interview with Pulitzer Prize winner Corey Johnson, a reporter over here in the States. He didn't come up as like a traditional journalist. He kind of just learned by doing, and a lot of what he would do is just like old school door knocking, just going
Yeah,
face to face. If emails or phone calls weren't going answered, he'd just find their address and knock on the door. Lately, in maybe the last few years or so, certainly as the internet has really taken over, and social media and digital means of communication, I think we've lost sight of how personal journalism should be and used to be.
yeah,
And you getting face to face with these people, I imagine, was really what really earned that trust. And maybe you can speak
yeah.
to that, getting face to face in an age where everything is really faceless and almost impersonal.
Yeah, it's necessary. I mean, it's the same thing with meeting somebody. You have to meet them in person to get a feel for what they're like, and it was the same thing here. Is that to meet Eliezer, for example, the gentleman who speaks about actually finding the children. Who's in that group of 4. He was so cautious about meeting me. I tried to ring him several times from in London and never got through anywhere. And I know that a lot of the sources turn their phones off or change their numbers for the reason that they're getting hassled by journalists. They didn't want to talk to journalists because I think that they didn't think that they understood them. But a lot of it, yeah, I mean, it's very important that you meet face to face. But I should say that a lot of it also came from recommendation. So the reason that Eliezer finally opened his doors to me and actually sat down with me and told me a story and sort of continued to call me afterwards was primarily because the soldiers, the military, I sat down with all the military in great detail. Sergeant Rojas, Captain Montoya. I went to their homes and sat down with them again, listened to their story. We sat down for hours and hours and hours, and because they that group in that second group, it came from a recommendation from them. They knew that I was doing. I was treating this. I was really going to report this heavily and not misreport it. Not it's going to be fact checked. It's going to be I'm going to give them the time. It came from recommendation in that way. So the way that a lot of the indigenous opened up was, yeah, as I said, the military either gave them a call or sent them a text or actually visited them with me. So the military they were the catalyst in all this, really. But yeah, the face to face meeting is very important. I mean, I would never have been able to report it from over here because they just wouldn't have answered my phone calls. It worked out in the end, but it was it required lots of trips that I didn't think were going to go anywhere.
And speaking with Jonah, he talked about your doggedness in the reporting, and you've even said that too. It's just kind of in your nature, and I wonder, like, where does that doggedness come from, and how do you define it in your trade and how you go about the work?
I don't know where it comes from. I've always been a hard worker, but I love it. I suppose it becomes easy when it can be effective, because there's been so many times in the past where I've been struggling to get a source, or other journalists I know have been struggling to get a source. I think I'll always send that other WhatsApp. I'll always make that extra phone call when other people will give up. Because I really enjoy it, and often I find it that the piece can sort of really open up. Like this story really opened up by getting Andres, the father of the children, the not Manuel or Enoche, but the other, the father of the 2 eldest children. That really opened up because that was the only time I got a real sense of Magdalena, and I knew that he came in quite late, as I said before, and I just knew, having spoken to Jonah too, that I needed more context around Magdalena, and I couldn't work out how to get that. And we'd all put a whole load of effort and time into the story, and so I think it just comes from that. I just can't be satisfied until I get it. And once Andres came back to me and sort of gave me that sort of piece, it gave me the interview. As I said, I was going back and forth with his lawyer for about a month beforehand. But I just don't rest until I've got it, really. And that's. But I remind myself that I'm not asking so much for a favor from these people. yes, you are, because I suppose you're making money on it, and you are in a way capitalizing on their stories. But in the other way, I also like to think that I'm gonna give them, as I said, the platform to tell their story in a way that is properly done. And that was definitely an example with Andres, because he felt the journalist had overlooked him as the father of the children. He felt like the journalist who had approached him hadn't been sensitive to his story, hadn't listened to him properly. And I know that I reminded myself that there are often other people in the story that deserve a voice, and that was the case with Andres, and he's the best example of it, really. Sometimes I think to myself that, should I send another message? Should I give up on this source? But I always say, one more. I'll try once more, and often that final time is the time where it really unlocks, really.
Sometimes too, in making those extra calls to get that extra detail, as important as that is, sometimes you can get lost in it and
Totally, yeah.
forget that you have to eventually start to write the thing.
Yeah.
So at what point do you feel like you're comfortable turning that faucet off and be like, you know what, William, you got to start writing, buddy?
This one was a bit simple because I kind of had a very obvious lead for it, because the crash is so dramatic, and there was documentation by the Civil Aviation Authority in Colombia that you could sort of reconstruct that in great detail. So I could begin writing right quickly on this one. I mean, there was another option for the lead, which was actually the helicopter, the actual rescue, when they're actually rescuing the children. Because I had the pilot of the helicopter who spoke to me, Julian Novoa, who was brilliant. He went into such great detail. He was very charismatic too. I actually begin writing almost because I can imagine what the lead is going to be. So often I don't wait to write until I've done all the interviews. They're going on at the same time. I often find that once you've actually written the story and you've fleshed out the information that you have, I find that then you can actually really spot blanks. So you can spot where the gaps are in this story, the way you really feel as if you could that would really benefit from the reporting. So you can actually be very targeted with the actual sources that you're going to chase down. For example, I knew that I needed Andres for this. I knew that having somebody, one of the indigenous rescuers, who could actually describe to me the moment of finding the children, one of the four, would be really important. So I asked, yeah, you kind of continue to report, but I think that I begin writing quite quickly, and that can give me the direction of knowing exactly where the holes are that can really benefit from an extra paragraph.
And a moment ago, you said something, and Jonah brought this up too, that you were after a very definitive account of what happened here in this rescue, and
Mm,
that can be a lot of pressure to shoulder. Be like, oh shit, you gotta make sure no stone is left
yeah,
unturned, and
yeah,
and you get one crack at it to be
yeah.
definitive. And so, how did you kind of rise up to that moment?
I did feel pressure, to be honest with you. I did. It's a really funny feeling when you sort of go on a reporting trip, because you sort of fly into this country and you're just hoping that these sources are going to appear or are going to be around. And it's not like you can sign an agreement with them and be here on this date. With this one, I felt really, really pressured because it was a story that had been quite widely covered. So I had to really, really work out what I was going to tell the readers that hadn't already been reported before. It had been covered by the New York Times, CNN. Loads of newspapers had sent correspondents down there to report on it, and I had to sort of work out what else I could say. See, the first day I arrived, I sort of said, I landed at 7 in the morning, and I remember I said, Pedro Sanchez, I'm going to come and visit you right away, and that would give me some sort of content, sort of begin writing. And I remember I got there, I landed at Bogota Airport, and I remember I texted him like midday, and we had a meeting scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. I remember he cancelled, and I remember sitting there, and then I remember that I was supposed to go and visit Nicholas down in Puerto Leguizamo, and then he cancelled, and I was there like in my friend's apartment in Bogota, and I was like, oh my god, this is going to fall apart. One of them's, one of them's going. I was just panicking, and once you get the first interviews and you start to get every single person mentions another name, another person you must talk to, and then it just grew from there, really. And this one a lot of it grew off Pedro Sanchez, as I said, and the military. We had all the military first because they were all quite easy to track down. Pedro sort of flew in some of the military. He flew in like Montoya and Montiel and all these people to specifically just speak to me for the story. So I sort of had the span of the article quite quickly, because they were great talkers, and they sort of were so helpful in me in detailing it for me, and they remembered it extremely well. But then that left me in a strange territory, because I felt like I had all the military stuff really, really. down to a T in terms of amazing detail, amazing quotes, and amazing perspectives. But it also left a huge part of the story out, which was the indigenous side, and that took a lot longer. And there was definitely a big panic because it took me it was not easy tracking any of them down, sort of sit down with them in any sort of detail. But yeah, there was several panic stations, and
And you said that you write fairly early in the reporting process, and then you're able to target when you see the potholes in the road and everything. When you were in Colombia, would what would a day look like for you when you'd go out reporting? Would you come back to a hotel or your friend's house and write a bit or transcribe? Like how would that shape out?
no, I didn't write when I was over there. Reporting for me is because I was over there, I think, for 2 weeks, and it becomes such a incredibly exhausting process. It's like, I think I was listening to a podcast with Sam Anderson actually for the New York Times. I think it was on I can't remember which podcast it was now. He spoke about you entering these worlds, and you sort of, it's like your ears and your senses become highly sensitive for that period, and it is like that. You become highly sensitive during these interviews, sort of make sure you get the information that you want, because you don't have much time with any of them. I mean, you have enough time, but obviously, it's not like you can ring them up very easily afterwards, because especially the military, they could be in the field, that and the indigenous could be in the jungle. So I knew I had to get as much as I could from those meetings. Got names, got numbers, and if I couldn't track them down, then I sort of flew to the city where I thought they would be. And it was just a lot of it was quite speculative. As I said before, it became a little bit tricky because there was an earthquake when I was over there, so all the roads were shut off. So we had to end up flying a lot of the time, which made it more difficult. But yeah, it was honestly just flying. I mean, I said we had meetings with the military because they were very responsive, but the indigenous, it was just about flying to the towns where they might be, and sort of asking people, do you know anyone who was involved in the rescue? And fortunately, we got people who pointed in the right direction. Then we sort of literally ran into hotels and bars where they were, and asked them to speak with us. Really, there's this wonderful moment where you go, okay, like, I think I have enough to actually write this now. And obviously after that, then you fill in the gap, you fill in the blanks. Quite adrenaline fueled, very little sleep, going from city to city, trying to get these people trying to track them down, really, ultimately.
Mm. And when you feel like you have enough to write, how do you are you much of an outliner? How do you go about organizing what you've got?
Um, yeah, I really wish I could say I was more organized, but I sort of this one was a bit more difficult because all the interviews were conducted in Spanish, and I sent it to a friend of mine who translated and transcribed it to English. So I didn't really understand all of what was going on in the interviews. I understood enough Spanish to sort of understand the outline of it, but it really came together when I actually reviewed those transcripts. That's when I sort of really began to piece it together. But yeah, no, I didn't organize my files in great detail at all. To be honest with you, I sort of just filed the audio, went on to the next one, filed, and then sent off the transcripts. Unfortunately, when I landed back in London, all the transcripts had come back, and that's when the story came together. It really came together in my head.
A part of the story that I particularly loved was how the jungle feels like a character unto
Yeah.
itself, and you get a sense of how claustrophobic it is underneath the canopy of a
Mm.
tropical rainforest like the Amazon in Colombia. So I don't know, just maybe like kind of take us there and how you were able to really personify and characterize the ecology of where you were.
It was really from the accounts. It was like there were bits that didn't make it in the story. The real sense, like, the first time I really got a sense of how difficult it was firstly because the military were too scared to go in. I know that the special forces went in, but generally speaking, the Colombian military would have gone in and found that plane, but they were just too scared, or not, maybe not too scared, but they considered it too dangerous, let's say. So that gave me that was crazy to me, that was how dangerous it was.
Yeah, because they're one of the some of the people in the search parties. I mean, they walked upwards of like 1,000 miles of
Yeah,
zigging and zagging through to try to find these kids, and
yeah,
you could go barely a yard in front of you and be just shrouded in darkness, and you get a
yeah,
sense of how dangerous it is in there, and not to mention the predators that are lurking.
yeah. I mean, one of the great unknowns is they didn't know if there was paramilitary groups, or essentially armed men in the jungle, because that was obviously the big question at the beginning. But yeah, I mean, from what I understand, is that if you went within, if you drifted off 6 feet, especially after dusk, then you would be lost. And that's what happened to Wilson, essentially, isn't it? We believe is that we just don't know where he went. I mean, I think it was, yeah, it is. That's why these special forces walk so close. They walked in single file, within a few feet of each other.
And Wilson is a dog, one of
Yeah,
the search
yeah,
dogs in the story. Yeah.
yeah. We should say that. Yeah. So, I mean, it was an incredibly difficult area to form a search operation. I mean, you get a sense for how thick it was, given that they flew, the Air Force and the Avian line flew planes over the jungle, and they couldn't spot anything. I mean, the foliage is incredibly thick, incredibly dense, and that's what makes it so hard to sort of search, to sort of lead a successful search operation.
Yeah, and with Atavist stories too, so much of what they publish is very narratively propulsed. Beginning, middle, end, and telling a story in that sense. So, when did when you're formulating the story beats in your head and the structure in your head, how did you envision, this being the sort of the engine behind this? How did you draw that up to, keep us scrolling, keep us reading?
In terms of yeah, this story was quite different because there's actually so many key moments in it. Like,
Yeah.
there like the crash in itself is fascinating. Finding the bottle, by Wilma Miranda. Then you've obviously got, the indigenous, Edwin Packey and the group of men, with Renoke finds the plane. You've got these amazing moments of where even if you drift off, you suddenly got this amazing moment of quite gripping moments of during the search. Obviously, then you've got the ayahuasca moment towards the end. So I didn't. There were quite clear actually poles in the story that you could picture. The only difficult bit was the actually which Jonah did a great job of actually, solving, was the bit at the beginning, because actually for the first 15 days they found the plane on the 15th of May, if my memory serves me well. And for the first 15 days they didn't really find anything. I remember that RS 3 group, the third, special forces group, they found an abandoned fart camp, they believe, but nothing really happened during the first 15 days. But for the rest of the story, you had almost too many moments happening, because I sort of also wanted to add some texture into, the background of the socio-political situation in Colombia. I also wanted to talk about, the indigenous beliefs. There are many subject areas I wanted to explore, but at the same time there were loads of interesting moments, that I wanted to talk of, I wanted to sort of talk about, sort of describe. And thankfully, with the sources that I had. But the chronologies. What I mean to say is the chronology is. I think it kind of lends. It's quite a clear chronology in it all. I don't think you really need to tell it in a different way. I think I kind of wanted to keep it chronological, and I know that's something that Jonah I suggested too, because there's so many names in the story, that I think if you ventured off from telling it chronologically, it would have become probably little bit too difficult to follow.
Yeah, the one part, and I had emailed you about this too, just about the really cool structural decision of putting in the children's point of view, which comes late in the story, and that kind of breaks chronology a little bit. And there are any number of ways that could have been handled. That could have been kind of braided in, as they're trying to survive, and then the search party around them, and you find that they're like very close to each other at one point, and you don't really find that out until the end. And I always put a little spoiler alert at the top of the show here, so we can,
Yeah,
talk about that and how close those search parties were actually to these kids, and how close they actually were to the crash site itself. But
yeah.
you find that out at the end versus it being kind of sprinkled out throughout. So I just wanted to get a sense of, the decision making of that.
The boring reason is that we had almost all of it written before we had the children's account.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as Jonah and I discussed, is that we we didn't really want to mess with the structure of the piece, again, because we kind of had it pretty much laid out.
Mm-hmm.
The other reason for that is that the children's account, we didn't really know how much of the children's account we'd really get, because they are under governmental protection, and they weren't available for interviews. Or so we didn't really know how much information we would be able to get. So I didn't want it to feel thin when you sort of gave their account if you braided it in through the piece. I think in hindsight you probably could have braided it through, but we didn't know how much information we'd have to sort of braid through. So at that moment, it sort of felt right to sort of leave it towards the end, which I think works really well anyway. Actually, in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, it's what's interesting about hearing you say that is that, it was just the circumstances of when you got the information and where you were in the writing already that kind of dictated where that went. So it wasn't so much a creative choice at the very start of the thing, like this is where it kind of makes sense. It's like, well, this is the only place it can go right now, and in the end, not knowing the backstory of it, like it works brilliantly. So it kind of gives you an idea of all the different directions and tributaries you can go down, and it's still very effective and still works, and it's still powerful.
Yeah, I like it when you get to the piece. I like it when you read it because I think that the reader, it cuts. These pieces are long. I think this one's 11,000 words, and there's definitely that tension in the piece where you're dying to know the kid's account at that stage, and I think that it comes at the right time.
And something I wanted to pick your brain about also, and this is kind of in our email dialogue, given that you had been, in rewrites and the story you had written, you've been with it so long that you lose sight of how fresh it is, and you kind of glaze over. You're like, I don't even know if this is good anymore, and I can attest that it is brilliant. But when you've gotten to the point where you've read it so many times, you almost can recite it by memory. And like, how do you, rewrite in there knowing that it's like, okay, am I making this better? Is this still even good anymore? Like, how do you, what's the approach like for you?
It's really hard to know, and you never really know until it lands, to be honest with you. I have a few people I send it to, sort of ask, sort of see whether they can follow it, see whether, as I said, I have a tendency to over-report, which is I suppose a blessing and a curse in a way, because it does throw up all these fantastic characters that feature in the story, but obviously some of them simply don't add anything. For example, there were 3 or 4 characters that spring to mind that I had in the draft up until like last week, I think, before we closed it, that featured, but they just didn't add anything to the story. I had like a guy called Jair, who was another cousin of Firma Mendoza. There was a guy called Andres Londoño, who I told you about before, who was involved in the search in very minor ways, but it kind of overcomplicated the narrative. But it kind of, I depend heavily on my editor, Jonas. I trust him implicitly, to sort of know which bits to cut out and which bits didn't really add anything to the story. But as I said, I also send it to a few really trusted editor friends of mine who sort of will read it through and say, this section is a bit whatever, this doesn't really add anything. But it really does depend on my editor in that way. And that sort of relationship is really, really important. There's obviously, I suppose, part of me that also wants to give them a voice. It's kind of, I imagine it's quite frustrating for the source when they sit down and tell you their story for an hour and then they don't make then their voice isn't even in the story at all.
Yeah.
So there's something inside of me that always wants to mention that name. Part of, I suppose, also another part of it, I suppose, is sometimes you want to sort of, there's obviously something egotistical in it, sort of showing I got this guy who did this, but do they really add anything to the story? So it really, in answer to your question, it really depends on the editor, and I sort of have to trust them to sort of know what's important and what's not.
Well, as we're winding down here, as you know, longtime listeners, that I ask guests for a recommendation of some kind, and some people read the confirmation notes, which prompt them on that. And William was in a bit of a brain fog from having been a bit overworked, and he's also got a relatively very young baby in the house, and the recommendation thing caught him really flat-footed, and he's like, can I get back to you? And I said, sure, you can get back to me. And then he sent me an email, and he said, for my recommendation, please say Rummy, the card game, best played with 4 people. My girlfriend and I were staying with my mom and sister over Christmas because we have a newborn. and wanted an extra pair of hands. And it really is a great way to spend quality time together over a glass of wine. Great recommendation. I love that stuff. Some people say, like, I got to do a book. And in this case, it's like, no. Rummy is pretty amazing. All right. We did it. We got here. What's that, episode 399? Woof. Thanks to Jonah and William. I have nothing left to give, so no parting shot. You could always follow along the show at Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Threads and Instagram. And yeah, subscribe to the podcast if you don't. And no parting shot. Maybe next week. We got episode 400. What? Are you kidding me? There might be a song and dance number. Probably not. But don't count it out. I might do a Dick in a Box song and dance number with this shave that happened today. If you can't do, interview. See ya.